Dearest Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, I'm sure that the Chief Rabbi doesn't need to be announced and introduced, and certainly not by myself. But maybe I can share with you a personal story of the Chief Rabbi that touched me, and why it's such an honour to have him. Since this may be the last time I get the opportunity and the merit to introduce Chief Rabbi while he is still Chief Rabbi, let me tell you something about the Chief Rabbi that impacted me. Growing up, I went to JFS, and unlike many of my friends who grew up in JFS, I wore a kippah. And as I'm walking down in Camden Town, walking to the station, inevitably there were very often we were presented with, unfortunately, people who weren't exactly our friends. And many of my friends turned around to me and said, "Take off your kippah, don't let them know you're Jewish." And my response was to keep my kippah on anyway. And one day, one of my friends, or at the time wasn't such a friend, but we're still very close to this day, took off my kippah and started running down the street. And he said, "I'm not prepared to walk with you while you're wearing a kippah." And although it's a very specific scenario, I don't think it's isolated. I grew up with friends around me being embarrassed to be Jewish. They were scared. They believed they couldn't wear a kippah on their street. I'm very fortunate, the very first time I heard the Chief Rabbi speak, he made me realise that we're proud to be Jewish. He made me extremely proud to be a British Jew. But he also taught me something else. He taught me not only should you be proud about being Jewish, but you have the ability to make other people proud of their Judaism too. And it was for that reason that I decided to take my many years in community service and try and give a bit. And if I did anything, it was try to give people that same sense of proudness, that they are proud to be a Jew, proud to be a British Jew, and realise that every one of us can make a difference to other people. And I think that's a lesson I've learned from the Chief Rabbi. For this reason and many other reasons, we're very blessed to have the Chief Rabbi as a stand-in for my son, Ben Yomin. And please God, Ben Yomin should be able to learn the lessons from the Chief Rabbi and be able to inspire other people to be proud to be a Jew and to have the power within themselves to realise that they can make a difference to other people.
Rabbi Richard, Rabbi Celeste, beloved friends, what a fantastic turnout. I suppose I better say something. I tell you that you are demonstrating a great deal of faith, but thank you for being here, and thank you for making Bushey one of the great communities of your jury. I hope you're proud of your community, because I certainly am. I love it because there's a friendly atmosphere, such a friendly atmosphere here. I don't know if you know, we're going to read this coming Shabbat, Parshat Vayetze. We've already begun laning it, and you remember how it begins. Jacob is running away from home. He's afraid Esau will kill him, and he's on his way to his uncle Laban, and he stops in the middle at night, in the middle of his journey, and he dreams a dream of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven with angels ascending and descending. And he wakes up and he says, this must be a house of God, it must be a shul, and this is the gateway to heaven. And the commentators ask, how did Jacob know that this was a shul? A Beit Elokim, the first reference to one in the Bible. And they give the following rather mischievous answer. I don't know if you remember, but when he was lying down, he took Avnei HaMakom. He took the stones and he lay his head down, and he took the stones as a pillow. And the Midrash, the rabbi said, the stones started quarreling. Each one wanted Jacob to rest his head on them. So you see, when he woke up, he said, if even the stones are quarreling, it must be a shul. So many shuls, you come in, they're for ribbles, they're broigises, they're machlokis, But in Bushey, there's friendship, and there's welcome, and there's warmth. And that, for me, is absolutely wonderful. It's wonderful to see some old friends, Wally from Luton days, and goodness knows who else. But I love Bushey because we are as old or young as the things we care most about. And Bushey, throughout the years, has always cared for its young people. I love your youth centre. I'm sure I came for the opening, didn't I? Yeah, I'm sure I did. It was a thrilling thing, and to see Rabbi Richards looking after young people here, and to be interviewed by one of your young people, a budding journalist from JFS, age 14, but watch this space in 10 years' time, you'll all know his name. And it's a great community, so kol hakavod. May I just add 2 little footnotes to Rabbi Richards' story. Here it is. Did I tell you the story, Rabbi Richards? I don't remember. Years ago, this was the crucial moment for me. Years ago, we used to go, we used to go to this very exotic location each year for our summer holidays. Don't get upset, don't eat your heart out, but we used to go each year to Margate. And Hoicha fenced it. And I remember one Shabbos, there was a little shul in Margate, sadly the community has declined. But there used to be a little shul, we used to go there every Shabbos, and my Dad and I were walking back from shul, and I was wearing my yarmulke. This is before the days when people wore yarmulkes in the street. And a member of the shul, seeing us walking along, ran up, caught up to my father and said, Mr. Sachs, I don't want to embarrass you, but your son has forgotten to take his yarmulke. And he was only trying to be nice, And my father turned around to him and said to him, no son of mine will ever be embarrassed to wear a yarmulke in public. And as a little kid, hearing that from my dad, I just learned you walk tall. And that is my yarmulke story number 1. My yarmulke story, Harry, sorry, I didn't see you there. Harry, you oversaw all this stuff, and your son, whose name I forget. Michael, you created that youth set, you helped to build it, am I right? Well, kol hakavod to both of you. Friends, years ago, long before I even thought of being a rabbi, I used to teach philosophy. Something today called Middlesex University. In those days it was Middlesex Polytechnic, by Hendon Cell. So I used to teach that, and I used to wear a yarmulke. But I don't know if you know that Hendon campus, it's very exposed. There's a steep hill down there. And one day, there was a gale blowing. And as I was crossing the courtyard, my yarmulke blew off. And I ran across the courtyard and I picked it up and I put it in my pocket until I was inside the corridor. The next day, the head of the department, a non-Jew, called me in and said, Jonathan, is everything all right? I said, yes. Why do you ask? He said, well, I saw you were wearing that thing of yours yesterday, and I just wanted to know if you're all right. Now go figure. A non-Jew sees a Jew without a yarmulke, he worries. And that, again, made a huge impact on me. That when we have the courage of our convictions, when we walk tall as Jews, it's not just good news for Jews, it's good news for non-Jews as well. When they see us firm in our faith, it helps them to be firm in their faith. And we become a blessing to others as well. And I've heard this from too many Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Zoroastrians and Baha'i to number. When we walk tall, we help others to walk tall. So, anyway, I thought let's do a little bit of Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is on the way. Shall we do that? And I want to tell you the story that you don't know about Hanukkah. And here it is. Does anyone know where the story of Hanukkah is actually told? Anyone know? Yeah? Yeah. The story of Hanukkah is actually told in 2 books, both of which are what are called, they're in the Apocrypha, that we call them Sfarim Chitzoniim. What do I mean by that? I mean this. What do we call the Hebrew Bible? What do we call it? We call it Tanakh, right? Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Torah, the 5 books of Moses, they're the holiest of our books. Then a little below that, under the Nevi'im, the historical books like Joshua, Judges, the 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, plus all the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the shorter prophets. And then Ketuvim, which include things like the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, the Megillahs, and so on and so forth. The last writings to be canonized were the Ketuvim. And there were a group of rabbis who sat and decided which books are in and which books are out. And some books that are in Tanakh nearly didn't get in, and some books that nearly got in didn't get in. The ones that nearly didn't get in, for instance, were Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. I don't know if you've ever read Kohelet, but it's slightly Bushey, it's slightly it's a very challenging work. The Book of Esther. Apparently, people were worried that if you had the Book of Esther in the Bible, it would create anti-Semitism. It's a book about anti-Semitism, and they thought that it might create anti-Semitism. Some books nearly didn't get in. And some books that on the face of it should have got in, didn't get in. And the books, 2 of the books that didn't get in were Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. And they are therefore, the Catholics for some reason include them in their Bible, but we don't include them in ours. So if you read book 1 of Maccabees, it tells the story of the military victory of Matityahu and his children, most famously Judah the Maccabee, and how they defeated the Greeks under Antiochus Epiphanes, and how they rededicated the temple and celebrated for 8 days. Why did they celebrate? And in Maccabees 2, it has a very interesting explanation of why they celebrated for 8 days. And the answer is that year they were unable to celebrate Sukkot, which is 8 days in the month of Tishrei, because the temple had been defiled and there was a war going on and they weren't able to celebrate Sukkot. So on the 25th of Kislev, they celebrated the rededication of the temple by keeping an 8-day festival, the way Sukkot is an 8-day festival with Sukkot, 7 days of Sukkot, plus Shmini Atzeret. Nobody had ever heard of Simchas Torah by then. Simchas Torah is a very late addition to the calendar, around the 8th to 10th centuries. So we have all the story of the military victory, but there's one little piece that's missing. What piece do you think is missing?
Miracle.
Pardon?
The miracle of the night.
The miracle of the oil. Not mentioned at all. In either Maccabees 1 or Maccabees 2, no reference to it at all. It says that the Greeks defiled all the stuff in the temple, and so they re-purified all the kelim, all the appurtenances of the temple, among which was the menorah, and they relit the menorah, and they established an 8-day festival with Hallel, but no mention of the miracle of the oil. The only story told in the book of Maccabees 1 and 2 is the story of the military victory over the Greeks. And then, of course, we come across and that is, of course, the incredible story. What is incredible about it? Number one, it was a defeat by a handful of Jews of the greatest empire of the time. You know, Aristotle, I'm a philosopher, so I love Aristotle. The Rambam, Maimonides loved Aristotle. And I rather like Aristotle because in the old days, anti-Semites in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, thousands of years ago, put out a malicious rumor that Aristotle was Jewish. So I think I always felt warm to Aristotle. What's more, Aristotle must have liked Jews, because he had a Talmud, a disciple called Theophrastus. And Theophrastus was a big admirer of Jews. And the Greeks didn't understand the Jews at all. And they asked Theophrastus, who are the Jews? What are they? And he replied, listen to this, he replied, the Jews are a nation of philosophers. So, I mean, it's a wonderful compliment to be given. Of course, Aristotle's most famous disciple was Alexander the Great. Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon, who created in his lifetime the greatest empire the world had ever known, the Alexandrian Empire. As you know, after his death, it split in two. The Ptolemies, who ruled from Egypt, from Alexandria, and the Seleucids, who ruled from Syria. In the 3rd century BCE, Israel came under the rule of the Ptolemies. In the 2nd century BCE, it came under the rule of the Seleucids, one of whom was Antiochus IV, who was an extremely modest man and had everyone call him Epiphanes, which means God made manifest. So he fancied himself. So Antiochus IV did a number of things which were absolutely unacceptable to Jews. He erected a statue of Olympus Zeus in the temple, had people offer korbanos, sacrifices to pagan gods, and various other things, and banned the practice of Judaism in public, among Milan, and so on pain of death, and they rose in rebellion. And the fact that a handful of dedicated Jews could beat the greatest empire of the ancient world was in itself an extraordinary event. Secondly, Hanukkah is the only festival in Jewish history, until we come to modern festivals like Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. Believe it or not, it is the only festival you can read about in non-Jewish sources. Did you know this? We have lots of records of Egypt of the pharaohs, because they wrote their records in hieroglyphics on their temple walls. But there's no reference to the Exodus in all those Egyptian inscriptions. There's a reason why there's no reference to Exodus, because the Egyptians, like most other nations known in history, only recorded the good news about themselves. They never recorded the bad news. We, Lahachis, did the opposite. We only recorded the bad news. As Abba Eban said, we are the people who can't take yes for an answer. Anyway. So there's no record of the Exodus in ancient literature. There's no record, obviously, of the giving of the Torah, because there were not non-Jews then. There was no record, oddly enough, of the events of Purim. Strangely, because the Megillah says, Elohim Keduvim, what is it? Divrei Amerim, Madai Upras, are not all these events recorded in the chronicles of the Medes and Persians. But we haven't yet found in the chronicles of the Medes and Persians a reference to Purim. However, all the ancient historians wrote about Hanukkah. Why? Because it was an event that changed the history of the world. It was the beginning of the end of Greece and the beginning of Rome. So it was an event not only of significance to Jews, but of significance to the world, and everyone knew it at the time. So that is the story as recorded in the books of Maccabees. However, as I say, oddly enough, the books of Maccabees were not included in Tanakh, and the question is why? Because it should, on the face of it, be obvious that at least Maccabees 1 should have been included, because what do we have on Purim? We have a Megillah. We read the story. So we should have a Megillah on Hanukkah, and it was written. It's there. It's called Maccabees 1. And yet, it was never included in Tanakh. So the question is why? what is now fascinating is when we come to the second story of Hanukkah. And I want to tell you where we find the second story. Anyone know where the second story of Hanukkah appears? I'll tell you, there's a document which dates from Second Temple times called Megillat Ta'anit, the scroll of fasting. It's actually a scroll of not fasting. You know that big rubric in the Singer's Prayer Book of the days when you don't say Tachanun. We should all be Hasidim. There are a lot more days when they don't say Tachanun. There are certain days when you don't say Tachanun because they're happy days, and you don't say miserable things on happy days. So days on which you don't say Tachanun. And basically they are days on which you are forbidden to fast. And that is the scroll called Megillat Tanit. Now Megillat Tanit recorded a lot of days on which you don't fast. And I'm now going to read you the reference here in Megillat Tanit, which is quoted in the Talmud. In Masechet Shabbat, in the chapter called Babel Adlikim, we read the Mishnah of that every Friday evening. And it says the following, listen to this. My Chanukah. This is what the scroll of Tanis says. What is Chanukah? Ditani Rabbanan. B'chofei b'Kislev Yomei Duchanan Tamanya Inun. That on 25th of Kislev, they begin the 8 days of Chanukah. The little mispat bahul hisanas ban. You don't say a hesped, like if God forbid there's a funeral, you don't make a hesped. Like on Erev Shabbos or Rosh Chodesh or various days when you don't make a hesped. And you don't fast on. And this is what it says. When the Greeks entered the temple, Timu kol hashmanim shebehechal, they defiled all the oils in the temple. And when the Hasmoneans prevailed over the Greeks and defeated them, they searched and they could only find one cruse of oil which had the seal of the high priest unbroken, and there was only enough oil to last for 1 day, and there was a miracle, and they lit the menorah for 8 days, and the next year they fixed 8 days on which to have a festival with Hallel and Thanksgiving. Now, do you notice something odd about that sentence? The entire victory of the Greeks is turned into a subordinate clause. When the Greeks came in, and when the Jews beat them, then they discovered this single cruse of oil. So they turned this whole incredible, world-changing military victory into a minor detail, and the major story is the oil that lasted for 8 days. And the question is, what happened between these two stories? It's very interesting. I'll tell you what happened. The first thing that happened was, when the Jews actually, when the Maccabees won, they became kings of Israel. They were not descendants of King David. They were known as the Hasmonean kings. And one of the strange things is this. They became rather Hellenized themselves. They fought against the Greeks, but then, you know what happens? You mix with the Hayach Fenster, you become like the Hayach Fenster. So, they became also themselves very assimilated people. They also did one thing which the rabbis were very, very upset about. We think it was America that first invented separation of church and state. That was Thomas Jefferson's great achievement, the First Amendment. However, way back in the days of the Bible, there was already a fundamental separation between shul and state, except they didn't have shuls in those days. So, what was it? There was the political authority who was, ancient times wasn't the prime minister, it was the king. And the head of the religious head of the community was the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. So these were two separate functions. A king couldn't be a Kohen Gadol, and a Kohen Gadol couldn't be a king. You had a separation between the political arena and the religious arena. That is the basis of separation of powers in Western civilization. It came back into the West in the 18th century with somebody called Montesquieu, who wrote a book called L'Esprit des Lois, also a very philo-Semitic guy, and eventually from Montesquieu it came to Jefferson and etc. The Hasmonean kings did a very mischievous thing. The first Hasmonean king, whose name was like mine, he was called Jonathan, made himself king and high priest at the same time. And the rabbis did not like this at all. They said to him, Hari yesh lecha malchus, you've got the royal crown. Vishkachtem gam kuhuna. You also want to be high priest as well. One should be enough, either one or the other. So the Hasmonean kings not only became assimilated, but they did the Greek thing. Because the Greek thing was, and even more so the Roman thing was, to turn the political head, the king, into a kind of quasi-religious hero. In fact, the Romans went worse. Why do we call July July? Because of Julius Caesar. Why is August August? Because of Augustus Caesar. They turned them into demigods. They made statues, and everyone had to bow down. And that was something Judaism is utterly opposed to. And that is one of the reasons why the sages did not allow them to did not include their account of their own victory, which they wrote in the books of Maccabees 1 and 2. They didn't allow it to be included in the Tanakh. Because for them, the Hasmoneans, who started so well, nonetheless went off in the wrong direction. How long did the military victory last? Well, the trouble is it didn't last for all that long. In the year 69 BCE, already Pompey invaded Jerusalem, entered the Beit HaMikdash, and by then Jews came under Roman rule. So their independence only lasted less than a century. So by then, already, we can see in Megillat Ta'anit that by then the rabbis and the sages of the time said, you know what? The most important thing about Hanukkah is the spiritual thing, not the military and political thing. And something that had been a minor detail of the early story suddenly took on its great significance. Now, I want us to move forward to the year 66 of the Common Era. The year 66, Israel has been under Roman rule now for almost 130 years. And all of a sudden, Rome is becoming repressive the way the Greeks were. You know, people think the Romans were very tolerant, the Greeks were very tolerant. Forget it. They were intolerant except to Jews, you know. So, as you know, Jews rose up in rebellion. It was called the Great Rebellion against Rome. And they thought they would do what the Maccabees had done 2 centuries earlier. But unfortunately, by then, Jewish life had become much more divided. And the Romans were pretty ruthless. And in the year 70, the temple fell. You know, Vespasian and then Titus besieged the city and the temple fell. Something happened that I don't know if you know about, which is some rabbis decided to abolish Hanukkah. Did you know this? They decided to abolish Hanukkah. We have the debate recorded in the Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and the question, and some rabbis held, Bodla Megillas Tanis. Every event that was celebrated as a festival and listed in Megillas Tanis, including Hanukkah, is now null and void. Can you see why somebody might say Hanukkah should be abolished? Why did they celebrate Hanukkah? Because they rededicated the temple. Are you supposed to celebrate the rededication of the temple when you have no temple? Are you with me? It had all vanished into dust. And therefore there were certain people who said all these festivals, including Hanukkah, are abolished. And we know that in the town of Lud, you know, near Ben Gurion Airport today with lots of orange groves, in the town of Lud, some rabbi decided to decree a fast. You know, in Israel they fast for it to rain. You know, in England we fast for it to stop raining. But the rain hasn't fallen, they ordain a public fast. And somebody ordained a public fast in Lud on Hanukkah, which meant that the official rabbinate of Lud was abolishing Hanukkah. And some other rabbis got very upset about this. Rabbi Yeshua and who was it? Rabbi Yeshua? Anyone remember? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. That's right, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. They sent Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua to Lud. And Rabbi Eliezer went for a swim in the public swimming pool, in the public baths. And Rabbi Yeshua had a haircut. Why? Because there are two things you don't do on a fast. You don't swim in a swimming pool, and you don't have a haircut. So it wasn't enough for them to say, guys, you're wrong for abolishing Hanukkah. We're going to show you how wrong you are, because we're going to do some things that you just don't do on a fast. So, and in the end, Hanukkah was saved. But go figure, why was Hanukkah saved? How was Hanukkah saved? And the answer is that Hanukkah was only saved because in the course of a century and a half, the Jewish people had decided that that first story was not the primary one. The second story was the real one. Let me explain. There were two battles against the Greeks. Number one was a military battle fought by armies. But number two was a cultural battle. Exactly Rabbi Richard's point. You know, are we prepared to stand up and wear a yarmulke? Are we prepared to stand up and say, we're not like everyone else? The Greeks were fantastic guys, you know. They invented the Olympic Games. It was a wonderful Jew, Ludwig Goodman, who invented the Paralympic Games. But the Greeks invented the Olympic Games. Their architecture was magnificent. Have you been to Athens? You've seen the Parthenon? It's gewaltig. The painting was magnificent. Their philosophy was good. Yeah, their theatre was brilliant stuff. Absolutely brilliant. But Yidden were not like that. You know, sorry, I know it's changed since the State of Israel, but I'm a real Jewish boy, you know. It says on his report, not good at games. Chess, debating, you know. So the Greeks were physical, we were spiritual. The Greeks looked at the visual arts where we thought, you know, we were much more verbal than visual. We were talking and listening and arguing. And we were different cultures. There's no question the West was based on these two cultures. Ancient Greece, ancient Israel, the culture of Athens, the culture of Jerusalem. But there were different cultures. And in the end, the rabbis looking back over history said, you know, the real battle was not the military one, it was the cultural one. And we can see now how right they were. Because the military victory lasted 100 years. But the spiritual victory has lasted more than 2,000 years. And the symbol of that spiritual victory was not a book about battles fought and won. It was a story about the symbol of the Jewish spirit, that one little cruse of undefiled oil that just keeps on burning and keeps on giving light. The Jewish spirit that is not extinguished. And that became the real story. And because of that, when it came to the destruction of the temple, and the rabbis sat and said, shall we continue Hanukkah or shall we not continue Hanukkah? They said this: the building, the temple may have gone, but the hope hasn't gone. We still have the hope. I once saw some teachers with some 5-year-old kids, It sounds like a bit of a savage thing to do to 5-year-old kids. But they wanted to teach kids a lesson they'd never forget. So they had the kids make a model of Jerusalem. And they had the kids listen to a tape in those days before we had MP3s, you know, back in the Jurassic Age. Remember those days? And they had played a tape for the kids with a song about Yerushalayim, and the kids learned the song. And at the end of the day, the teacher did something to shock the kids. The teacher smashed the model and pulled out all the tape and shredded the tape. And she said to the kids, "Kids, do we still have the model?" And they said, "No." And then she said, "Do we still have the song?" And they said, "Yes." Are you with me? You lose the physical thing, the model, but the song, the spiritual thing engraved in your mind and your memory, you never lose. And that way she taught the kids, those 5-year-old kids, the difference between a physical possession and a spiritual possession. You can lose a physical possession. You can't lose a spiritual possession. And that is why the rabbis were able to say, we may have lost the physical Jerusalem, but we haven't lost the Jerusalem in our mind and in our heart. And we haven't lost the hope. And because of that, Jews came back to Israel. And because of that, Jews came back to Yerushalayim. And that is the story of Hanukkah that you didn't know. That second narrative. Because of that, we have the festival, and now, today, Baruch Hashem, we have Yerushalayim. I want to say one last thing in closing. And I say that in the context, has there been a ceasefire been agreed? I haven't seen it.
Not quite.
Not quite, but I'm hopeful it will be. I want to tell you this. There's one little halakha, one little item of Jewish law. It's the last paragraph in Maimonides' code of laws of Hanukkah. And it is a law I want you never to forget, even though you'll never have it. You know that we light on Hanukkah one light the first night, 2 the second night, 3 the third. But all of that is called Mahadrim min ha-Mahadrim. That's the best way of doing it. But if you're really stuck, what is the essential mitzvah? Anyone know? The essential mitzvah is 1 candle per night. We all do the deluxe version, but the basic vanilla Tesco's own brand version is 1 candle per night. If you light 1 candle each night for 8 nights, you fulfill it. Ditto on Shabbos. We all light 2 candles, but the essential mitzvah is 1 candle. So the question is raised in Jewish law. If on Friday afternoon of Shabbos Hanukkah, you only have 1 candle, what do you light it as? A Hanukkah candle or a Shabbos candle? Now everything in your mind says you've got to light it as a Hanukkah candle. Hanukkah only comes once a year. Shabbos comes 50 times a year. And besides which, Hanukkah is a big sign of a miracle, and Shabbos is just, it's not that light. But the truth is, the law is, and with this, Maimonides ends with this ayah. If you're faced with that choice, you light it as a Shabbos candle. Why? Mishum sheneh Shabbat mishum shalom bayit. Because the Shabbos light represents peace in the home. It says the Rambam, Gadol HaShalom, and great is peace, Shekol HaTorah Kula Lo Nitna Ela L'Aseh Shalom. Because the whole Torah was only given to make peace in the world. Now go figure. Here is the greatest military victory our people ever had until modern times. And yet when faced with a choice, which takes priority? One little bit of peace or the greatest victory in war? One little bit of peace takes priority over the greatest victory in the world. Why do Jews win their battles? Because they only fight them, not because they love war, but because they seek peace. And that is why Israel today is the great nation it is. And why all the countries around Israel, who spend their time fighting one another, are living sadly poverty, which, if they would only learn from Israel, they could. Israel would help them find their way to hope and to a future for their children. Friends, we are the people who only fight when we need to defend our lives and our country. But our deepest hope is for peace. May Hashem send Shalom al Yisrael in Hera Yonei.